a low-cost environment for doing business today. We have the highest corporate income tax rate in the country, the sixth highest personal income tax rate. And as we looked at this and digested it with our members, one of the biggest points of concern is just the fact that, the cost of fuel is one place where we're kind of, competitive nationally today. We don't have the highest cost of fuel, we don't have the lowest, but we're kind of in the middle. And, we tend to be a little bit lower than the national average when it comes to the cost of fuel. But this would blow that out of the water and would put our cost of fuel, which is a huge input into our economy, right up there with some of our high national rankings on taxes and other business costs. So, it's something that would just make it that much harder to do business in the state of Minnesota, and would take again something where we have a little bit of cost competitive advantage versus some of our neighbors in other places around the country, and just throw it out the window.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for being with us for another episode of American Potential. When government wants to force a solution, it may not take into account if the technology is there or if it's what the consumer wants. They almost never take that into account. Some states are taking extreme measures to curb emissions by putting standards out that could negatively impact the livelihood of the people that live in those states. Some effects of this heavy-handed approach can lead to higher costs, shortages, and even fewer choices for people in that state. Let's take Minnesota, for example. In their last legislative session, they introduced a bill called the Clean Transportation Standard. Sounds good on the surface, but the reality is far from it. This bill would have hiked up prices on essential fuels that keep goods moving across the state. It was such a flawed proposal that it managed to unite people from both sides of the aisle in opposition, a hard thing to do in politics and legislative bodies today. Two of those organizations were the Chamber of Commerce and the National Federation of Independent Business, representing a combined 16,000 businesses in the state. And today, we're talking to representatives from each organization. I want to welcome to the show Bentley Graves from the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and John Reynolds from the National Federation of Independent Business. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Yeah,
you bet. Well, this is an interesting topic, and look forward to discussing it with you. It seems like politicians come up with ideas like this all the time, trying to force the market or change the market through legislative action rather than just leaving it up to the market to sort decide and determine. But let me start with you, Bentley. Talk a little bit about first let's talk about your organization and what the Chamber of Commerce does. Who are some of your members in Minnesota?
Yeah, so we represent more than 6,000 employers across the state. And that's, businesses in every corner of the state, every size of business in every industry. So we have members that range from, some of our 17 Fortune 500 companies in Minnesota down to sole proprietors and mom and pops and everything in between. So we like to say that we are the voice of business at the Capitol, and I think we have a lot of reason to say that, given the size and scope and breadth of our membership.
All right, and John, how about NFIB, or National Federation of Independent Business in Minnesota? Talk about your impact.
Sure. NFIB represents a little over 10,000 small businesses in the state and about 300,000 small business owners nationally. We're a little bit different from most business organizations in that we are exclusively focused on small businesses and small employers. Our average member employs about 10 people and earns about $500,000 in annual revenue per year. So you're talking very small. Then we do run the gamut as well, from hair salons to auto repair shops to parts manufacturers to well drillers. We've even got a guy who makes custom scrapbooking cabinets out in Hutchinson, Minnesota. It's an incredible business. He's a former 3M engineer who started his own company about 10 years ago and ships to, I think, 40 different countries around the world. And so I love this job, and I love NFIB because you just never know what you're going to get from the members. So many good stories.
Yeah, that's incredible. Custom scrapbooking cabinets. I can't even quite picture what those would be, but isn't that great? Like, that's what's so great about America. Somebody can start a business that's that niche and survive, and sounds like thrive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's great. All right, Bentley, let's have you kind of explain this clean transportation standard, and the ones that were going to be in this bill.
Yeah, well, I'll do my best. So this starts with this idea that, over time, the fuel sold in the state of Minnesota ought to become less carbon intensive. And I think, there's lots of reasons to hold that as a goal. And I think there's a lot of different ways to get there. But the way that this particular proposal intends to get there is to ratchet down over time through kind of state mandate, the carbon intensity of the fuel sold. So the idea is that any fuel sold in the state, today meets a certain carbon intensity score. But if this were to pass over time, again, that would ratchet down. So by 2030, the fuel sold in Minnesota would be 25% less carbon intensive. By 2040, they'd be 75% less carbon intensive. And the goal was to get to 2050 by having fuel sold in the state, essentially with no carbon intensity. And the way they do that is by increasing the price of those fuels that don't meet that standard. And so what that does, as you kind of alluded to earlier, is that, really kind of right out of the gate, that would increase the cost of fuel in the state of Minnesota by up to 50 cents a gallon, and would just go up from there. I mean, so much so that it would get to over $1.50 a gallon more down the road. So, as you said in the beginning, it is a mandated approach to try and solve this problem. But we know there are other ways to do that as well. I mean, not the least of which is just, if Minnesota did nothing at all, we know from the analysis that's been done here in the state that we would, just by current market forces, hit a carbon intensity reduction goal of 30% with doing nothing more than what we're doing today.
Right. Yeah. This is what fascinates me about this. And there's so many examples of it. At the federal level, they do the fuel efficiency standards where they just, like, legislators just snap something out of thin air and say, by this date, we're going to do this. I mean, they might as well just say in a piece of legislation that by 2070, all Minnesotans are going to ride on magic carpets, right? Like, I mean, it doesn't matter how you get there. They just want to say something like that in a piece of legislation and not take reality into account. And this drives up the cost. And that's what we're going to talk about here. If you look at fuel efficiency standards at the federal level, it's driving up the cost of vehicles. There is a price to pay for this. And you dodged a bullet, I think, in Minnesota, obviously by killing this piece of legislation. But that's what would have happened, right? Is that the price of energy would have skyrocketed, gone through the roof because of this kind of crazy legislation. Any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I mean, it really is government stepping in and picking winners and losers and forcing pretty much devastating cost hikes both on consumers and small business owners and people up and down the economic ladder in Minnesota. And, I think, as you said, as the outset, it's really not reflective of what customers or what consumers, what people actually want, which are cleaner, yes, but affordable and reliable transportation fuels that can get you where you need to go every day.
Yeah. What do you think of my idea of mandating magic carpets? Is that something that the legislature might take up?
I mean, I'm a big Steppenwolf fan. I'm sure that there are a few in the legislature that were too.
Yeah. John, last session, it wasn't the first time that the state discussed fuel standards. Is Minnesota looking at other states for these standards, or are they just kind of coming up with this stuff on their own?
Well, I think every politician in the Minnesota legislature would probably tell you that their ideas come out of their own heads,
right.
And they develop everything on their own, and it's custom tailored to what Minnesota needs and wants. But everybody knows that California, Oregon, and Washington have passed versions of whatever you want to call it, clean transportation standard or low carbon fuel standard. So those are the states that other lawmakers are looking to And, versions of these programs are being shopped around the country by, large corporate funded non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, right, that are always trying to push a stricter and stricter, or push it further and further from state to state to state. So in a lot of ways, the Minnesota lawmakers who support this, looked at Oregon, California, and Washington, said, "Oh, hold my beer, because we can do one better here," and really ratcheted up the Bentley outlined the carbon intensity reduction standards that were included in the most recent version of the bill. And those go way beyond where California, Oregon, and Washington have went, which is what results in that significant per gallon price increase for consumers. And to put that in real dollar terms, some studies have said, by 2030, it'd be an extra $1,100 a year for most rural drivers, even almost an extra $400 a year in gasoline costs for people that live in the Twin Cities area and don't have to commute as far. It's a real hit. And for, NFIB members, they're feeling it on both sides, right? Because it's less money that their customers have to spend in their stores or for their services. And it's also, for most of our members, coming right out of their bottom lines too, because they rely on heavy trucks or bigger equipment to do their work, and it's just more and more and more expensive.
Yeah, well, and this is what I think so frustrating for people is, I'll just be honest. I'm just going to say it: the arrogance of people, of legislators. I'm just going to say that, right? To look at this and say, well, this is something we're going to impose. We're not giving the citizens a choice in this area, but somehow they think that it's okay to cause the price of gas to go to 5 or 6, or, maybe, you talked about California, Washington, and Oregon. Hey, hold my beer. Let me see if I can beat you in the price of gas for a gallon. There are real world implications to this, to, many of your members, to small business owners, and to families. I think of, single parent families who are just struggling to make it. Where is their voice in all this? It gets lost unless you guys, and I appreciate the chamber and NFIB and other groups stepping up and being a voice for them. But it just seems like, and I guess I'll throw this to you, Bentley. It just seems like that is the crux of this. It's just kind of a tone deafness on the part of some legislators.
But I think the biggest concern we have is frankly on that cost. Minnesota is for better or worse not known as a state that's a low cost environment for doing business today. We have the highest corporate income tax rate in the country, the 6th highest personal income tax rate. And as we looked at this and digested it with our members, one of the biggest points of concern is just the fact that the cost of fuel is one place where we're kind of competitive nationally today. We don't have the highest cost of fuel, we don't have the lowest, but we're kind of in the middle, and we tend to be a little bit lower than the national average when it comes to the cost of fuel. But this will blow that out of the water, and will put our cost of fuel, which is a huge input into our economy, right up there with some of our high national rankings on taxes and other business costs. So it's something that would just make it that much harder to do business in the state of Minnesota, and would take, again, something where we have a little bit of cost competitive advantage versus some of our neighbors in other places around the country, and just throw it out the window.
Yeah, and John, you look at this, and it drives up the cost of fuel, drives up the price of everything. It's driving inflation. In some ways, there's two things that drive inflation. We always try and hit this home. It's government spending too much money, and chasing too few goods, right? But it's also when you do make these bad choices, like on energy, and you make energy scarce, you make a resource scarce, it drives the cost of that up. And fuel is one of those things that when the price of fuel goes up, everything is transported, needs fuel to transport it. So that continues to drive inflation. John, your thoughts on kind of that and what it does to the standard of living of people?
Yeah, absolutely. You hit it on the head. When I talk to our family farm members, our trucker members, that's exactly what I hear is, look, we've been passing on higher and higher costs to our customers for the last 4 years, or going on 4 full years now of pretty heavy duty inflation. And there's only so much more that people can take, right? And there's only so much more we can pass on before it just doesn't work anymore. and to your point earlier about the arrogance is right. We don't have the technology. We have no idea how this would work. We have no idea how we would get to 100% reduction in carbon intensity, no more than we have any idea how we'd get to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. The technology does not exist, even if you had infinite amounts of money to spend, which we don't. And you're right, rising energy costs due to forced government scarcity is one of the biggest factors driving inflation that will continue to feed inflation and fuel the pinch for people. So, I don't see how this could work in Minnesota. I don't see how this could work in a state where people need to drive long distances to get to work, to bring their kids to school, to go to the grocery store.
Is this go ahead.
I was say the reality is we don't really know how it would work, frankly, in the market either. We don't know what the impact would be on our economy. These cost estimates that we've been using, are kind of extrapolated from analysis of that they've done in California on California standard. There was some study on a Minnesota-based local clean transportation standard, but as that report came out, they said very clearly we felt like it was outside of our scope to dig into what this would mean for cost and what this would mean for economic impact. So, again, all we're left with is being able to try and kind of extrapolate from the analysis that's been done on California standard, which, like I said before, is pretty close to what we'd be solving to. But even that, putting aside just the cost, to John's point about the importance of fuel in economic activity, California's own study said that their standards will lead to slower economic growth over time. And there again, I mean, we are a state that lags the national average in job growth and in GDP growth. We don't have any room to give on that front.
Yeah. And again, if we're going to follow any state, I'm not sure California would be the model I'd follow. I mean, people are leaving. Look at where people are leaving, right? And what states they're going to. They're going to freedom states, right? They're going to states that frankly have a lower cost of living because their politicians have made better choices for them in energy and other areas. This is crazy. What did you think? And we'll start with you, Bentley, and then John. What did you each think when you first heard about the state even looking at these standards?
Well, again, I mean, our first questions were, what would this do to our members and to their ability to compete, not just here in Minnesota, but nationally, internationally. And pretty quickly, like I said, we started to realize, well, this is have a real negative impact on their ability to do so. So, I mean, that was our first concern, is just, what are we likely to see as a result of this? And, there's an argument to be made for, kind of moving the direction in lower carbon intense fuels. But again, if we start with the assumption that doing nothing more will get to a 30% reduction, then I think we need to have a conversation about what can we productively do to kind of move that up without sacrificing cost and economic competitiveness.
Yeah. And I'll say, on NFIB side, one of the things I like about NFIB, and I think that distinguishes us a bit, is, we survey our members, right? We put questions and policy questions in front of them every year, sometimes multiple times throughout the year, and say, hey, what do you think about this? So we asked about low carbon fuel standard or clean transportation standard. 91% of our members, small business owners in Minnesota, oppose this, right? Only 4% support it. And then when it comes to raising taxes or fees for electric vehicle subsidies, 94% oppose it. So small business owners are decidedly against this type of government intervention and cost increase. And I think one of the really frustrating things, when I saw this come back in 2024, 2023, 2024, is in 2023, the Minnesota legislature, which completely blew out the state budget, right, took us from an $18 billion surplus as a state to a $2 billion deficit. As part of that, they spent $50 million in direct cash subsidies for various types of electric vehicle subsidies. So, to buy an electric car or to put in an electric vehicle charger, electric scooter subsidies, electric bus subsidies. I mean, you name it. And then to top it off, they also gave the largest electric utilities in the state the ability to tax their customers an unlimited amount of money to do electric car rebates, electric vehicle charging subsidies, electric boat subsidies, electric plane subsidies across the board. I mean, they could tax us. It's like they want us to. We're going to get to the Jetsons level, here. Right. It's crazy, and to not slow down and see, okay, of that $50 million, what actually worked? We just appropriated this. It's barely out the door. Do we have any sense of this is working? If it's responding to consumer demand, if it's moving the needle on emissions reductions, they have no clue. And without even, waiting and studying that, they want to jump right into the next thing that is going to increase the, price of driving your car by thousands of dollars per year. It's just nuts.
Now, there's going to be a whole group of people who listen to this show who may not understand who the Jetsons are, but I got to ask you, I mean, why not? You might be giving them some ideas. Maybe they'll start thinking that we can fly around like the Jetsons if they just will it so in a piece of legislation.
Oh, there have been personal rapid transit studies in Minnesota, millions of dollars spent on this. The idea of flying around in little Jetsons type cars going back 20, 30 years. So we're a nation leader in wasting your money on cartoon clown ideas.
Cartoon clown idea. I love it, man. We don't want to give them any more ideas. That's for sure. How about the chamber? What did the chamber hear when you talked to your members? What did you hear from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same level of concern. I think, again, there are plenty of places to go with this conversation in a productive way. I mean, again, if we just kind of understand that, as a base case, if we just continue on with where we are today with our policy and programs, we'll get to a 30% reduction. Then I think it's a question of how can we if we want to move that needle north of there, how can we do that productively without kind of sacrificing costs and economic competitiveness. But ultimately, yeah, the concerns came back the same as they did with the majority of John's members, which is we don't have room in Minnesota to pay more to do the work that we do. We don't have room in our economic competitive to slow things down any more than we already are. And ultimately, this also kind of assumes that Minnesota can do this as an island in the upper Midwest all by itself. We are not California. We are not the economy that California is, or California or Washington, Oregon are together. This assumes that these fuels would be readily available to Minnesota, even though that California and the West Coast may well be outbidding us for them. In which case, not only would it be harder to meet these goals, but it would just be that much more expensive.
Yeah. Let's talk about, so each of your organizations decided to be a part of this coalition to stop this bill. But as I alluded to in the beginning, this was a broader group, right? You had people kind of on the left and on the right who came out to fight this piece of legislation.
Yeah, I think one of the distinguishing things about the debate over the clean transportation standard in Minnesota this year versus other years is having this fully fleshed out schedule of 25% reduction by 2030, 75% reduction by 2040, and 100% by 2050. I think one thing that elicited was the writing on the wall is clear for biofuels, for ethanol and biodiesel and those types of transportation fuels. And so you had, I think, a lot more resistance from a lot of the agricultural production groups that were not willing to kind of play ball on, okay, well, we can put our toe in the water so long as we're not completely sealing our fate, right? And so we had lots of other elements of the business community that you would expect, but you also had agricultural groups, I think, being more vocal in their opposition. And then you had from, the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you had environmental groups who said this didn't go nearly as far or fast enough, right? And that we need 100% reduction in carbon. We need to ban, combustion engine cars by 2030. We need to go beyond California and Massachusetts, and we need to take that leap, basically off the cliff. So there was opposition kind of all over the place, and that probably. The opposition from environmental groups who said it wasn't radical enough, probably did substantial damages to the chances of it passing, along with the business community's pretty steadfast opposition.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah. It was, I know, I mean, John's absolutely right. It was an interesting moment to see the kinds of concern that came up over this, like John said, both from the Ag Committee, which is a strong voice, in Minnesota, that had their own concerns about where this leaves their market, in the future, but also from, like John said, those that believe that this is, not only not far enough, but in some cases this is worse than where we are today. From folks in the kind of the environmental advocacy space, but we also had the business community represented by the chamber, represented by NFIB, and a few other groups testified and raised our concerns. But there was also opposition from some labor organizations as well. Largely, again, rooted in the idea of cost and the idea of raising the cost, not just of getting around, but the idea of raising the cost of doing things in Minnesota.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, that's a growing concern. I would think labor unions would recognize that this strikes at the heart of their membership, right? This is a jobs issue for people. I mean, and you would think that many labor unions would understand that.
And two of the largest employers in the Twin Cities metro area are oil refineries that employ thousands and thousands of union workers, right? And high skilled, high paying, really good jobs. Those refineries who are not NFIB members and are, probably a million times larger than our average member. They've invested a ton of money in updating their facilities over the last decade, which trickles back into the local community, into more jobs, and really helps the ecosystem. And it also helps Minnesota produce some of the cleanest gasoline and cleanest fuels really in the world. And to pass a mandate like this, where we have no idea what the consequences might be in 5, 10, 15 years, would put all of that economic investment and all of those jobs in jeopardy.
All right. Now, keep in mind, this is a family show. So you got to just think before you answer this question. Where did they pull these standards out of? I mean, I guess you could say thin air. There's other ways you could say it, but like, where did they come up with the year and the 0 and the 75% by this year? Was it science-based? Did they just pull it out of a hat? I mean, what's your thoughts?
Well, I don't want to step on Bentley. I'll give you one answer to that, which is, you're going back to what I said earlier, right? You have these groups ranging from Sierra Club to the Great Plains Institute to the Rocky Mountain Institute, right? Whose purpose in large part is to continue to push ever more radical versions of this type of mandate. And it's not just low carbon fuel standard. It's, they have the same types of mandates for heating fuels. California has the low emission vehicle and zero emission vehicle, the electric car mandates, basically. There's kind of a mandate for every facet of the economy that is very similar to a low carbon fuel standard. And those groups they're very well funded organizations, and they go state to state to state, and they push ever more radical versions until they hit in one. And then they move on to the next state and do the same thing. And then they come back to the state where they pass it and said, hey, okay, 5 years have gone by. It's time to ratchet it up. Let's go. So where they come up with the actual numbers, I don't know. But, that's the process, right? And I guess for the actual numbers, I'd go back to the Jetsons.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was clear, that these were kind of aspirational targets in some respect. I mean, in talking to some legislators, they would say, we understand the technology is not there today, but we believe that, there's an important role for the government to kind of put a signal out there to direct kind of the market in where we want it to go. So I think, generally speaking, there's a recognition that this is not, kind of doable today with today's technology. But again, this idea that we need to kind of set them on the path, and, if we mandate it, they will come. But it's also important to note the little bit of study that was done here in Minnesota on a Minnesota specific clean transportation standard. That analysis, that recommendation was pegged to a lower set of standards than what we saw in the bill. The set of standards that we saw in the bill was kind of on the very, very, very far end of what the state's analysis thought was even remotely possible. And yet that's what ended up in the statute, which is, concerning to say the least. But again, I think kind of underscores this idea that, well, maybe we can't get there today. Maybe it's not, kind of reasonable today. But nevertheless, it's the state government's job to push the market in that direction and see where it goes.
Yeah. I wonder when that became the state's job to push markets certain ways. That's interesting. I didn't know that was the role of government, but
that's the prevailing kind of legislative philosophy for a lot of lawmakers in Minnesota. I mean, it's probably foreign to a lot of your listeners, but that is how a lot of lawmakers in Minnesota think.
Yeah. Well, that's unfortunate. So let's talk about that. I mean, if this would have passed, it would have been in addition to a lot of other regulations that already exist, that the state's already passed, that sort of negatively affect businesses, right?
It was a pretty brutal 2 years for businesses in Minnesota, I would say. Right. And I think most NFIB members would say it was a brutal 2 years, from employer mandates like a $1.5 billion per year payroll tax to pay for a new government-run paid family medical leave program to a paid sick time mandate that requires 10 days off for every employee, regardless, full-time, part-time, seasonal. We had a gas tax increase tied to an inflationary measure. So every year from here to eternity, the gas tax in Minnesota is going to ratchet up according to that inflationary measure. We had about $10 billion in tax increases, again, despite that $20 billion state surplus. $10 billion in total tax increases over the next 4 years. It was wild. And, I do lots of radio interviews, lots of TV interviews to talk about the impact on small business owners. And the question I always get is, well, do your members talk about leaving? And what I have to remind everyone is most small businesses can't just pick up and leave, right? Their business is the community. Their customers are the community in which they've grown up and lived and grown their business. And, picking up stakes and moving to Texas or Florida or Iowa or North Dakota, South Dakota is just not an option, right? So either they sink or swim where they are. And, the state of Minnesota is tying a weight around a lot of them right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, headed into the last 2 years, Minnesota already faced headwinds. Like I said, we are a state that for the better part of a decade or longer, have lagged the national average for GDP growth, have lagged the national average for job growth. We're a top 10 state for losing people. Those are headwinds that existed. But as John said, there's a host of things that have been passed in the last 2 years in this kind of trifecta environment that will just make that harder. And we hear the same thing from our members. Please stop. We're doing what we can to contribute to the state's economy, to put people to work, to make Minnesota the great state that it is. But more and more of this just makes it that much harder. And, frankly, we hear the same thing. Our business is going to leave. And yeah, some of them probably will. Some of them maybe already have. But more often than not, what we hear from our folks is they're just not expanding here. They're not investing in Minnesota. They maybe aren't going to pick up and leave tomorrow. But they're not going to grow here. They're not going to invest here. And we know from data that we have at the chamber through our foundation that we are at a deficit of net business investment compared to our neighboring states. And none of this stuff makes that better. None of this stuff solves to turning the needle in a more positive direction on that. Yeah.
How about next session? I mean, do you think this bill comes back next session?
Well, it's hard to say exactly at this moment, 24 hours out from the election. Will it come back? Absolutely. It'll be reintroduced 100%. This bill will be reintroduced, whether it's in the same form where it goes, 25% reduction by 2030, 75 by 2040 and all that. I'm not sure, but I would expect a pretty radical version, right, to start off the bat. And whether it advances really depends on who controls the state legislature in Minnesota.
Yeah. Wow. That's a bleak assessment, really, of where you are in Minnesota. But I think this is something that other states need to take a look at too, right? And see what you're going through in Minnesota. You're not far behind states like California and others. And, kind of this oppressive, scheme that's out there for businesses. I think it's difficult, but I want to thank you both for joining us. Thank you, Bentley. Appreciate you being with us. Thank you, John. Appreciate you being with us as well.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. Well, This is a great example of how this all matters and whether you can, from a grassroots standpoint, put pressure on your legislators to not have these kinds of bills move through. I think both Bentley and John would probably agree that it took grassroots pressure from their members to work, and these other coalition groups as well, in order to stop this really bad idea in Minnesota. But it's not just about Minnesota. These ideas, as was pointed out, are coming up in state after state, and you've got to be there to really work hard to make sure that these kinds of ideas, crazy ideas that drive up the cost of living for average everyday Americans, and ultimately that's who's being forgotten in this discussion. This is about interest groups. It's about political agendas. But what they're forgetting about, these legislators, is average people. You, people who listen to this show, who can make a difference. And so I would urge you to stay involved and do everything that you can to make sure that you put that grassroots pressure on your legislators so that this kind of stuff doesn't come up again. Look, liberty and freedom, they're easily taken for granted. Don't ever take liberty and freedom for granted. Go out there and fight to defend freedom and liberty. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.